Here I'm going to mark out the outlines of the collar stand using bias tape. I kind of like using bias tape. There's advantages to using bias tape instead of actual tape when you're draping. Today I can't seem to find my sticky, narrow red tape, so I'm going to use bias tape. It's pretty easy to work with. You just make sure that when you pin it into your mannequin, that you keep your pins fairly close to the mannequin. Some people will drive the pin all the way into the mannequin. Sometimes I do that, but I actually try to avoid it. Over time, doing that damages the outside fabric of the mannequin. But there's no absolute right way to do it, so just make sure that when you pin your lines onto your mannequin, they get pinned pretty cleanly. You could cut at the end of each bit of bias tape, but I find that wasteful, so here I've left some extra right around the corners so that I can just miter the corners, and then I've got my marker in the back. And I'm going to do the same thing here in the front as well. So try to get everything flat. These are marks. They're not going to be like a part of your final garment. So you don't want your tape, whether you're using bias tape or sticky marking tape, you really don't want it to be too bulky. So try to keep it as flat as possible. And that's what it looks like when you're all done marking with the bias tape. So now I am going to start marking the important places on the bias tape so that I can draft a pattern on paper. So this first mark I'm making, I'll call it A, that is the front center of the neck. That is a really important marker. That's where we're going to start our pattern making. And this mark here that I've made, that is marker B. That's the back neck. So that is going to be the second mark that we're going to make when we make our paper pattern. Now, here's mark C, and I'll go ahead and put a placeholder there for now while I explain to you how we arrive to point C. And then this is going to be point D. Point D is the bottom neck point. So if you feel where your clavicle is, that's kind of where point D is going to be in this example. Now point E, this is the mark for the center back of the neck on the lower side of the collar stand that we're making. And point F, that is going to be the lower part of the side seam. So that side seam is where we're going to lengthen or shorten it in the future, but we'll talk about that later. So first, let's measure. Measuring is really important, especially when you are drafting your own pattern. So I'm going to start at point A, which is the center, kind of the center neck. We're going to start everything out from. And then I'm just going to go right around and measure all the way to the back. So when we get to the back, when we get to point B, we're at about 6.5 inches. So I will just go ahead and put a marker there. And that is going to be our measurement between points A and point B. So let's go ahead and start. I just used a sheet of, just copy paper to do this. So we're just going to mark a dot, and that's going to be our point A. And I really like using compasses because compasses are awesome. A compass is your friend. This particular compass, I think I picked up from a hardware store, of all places, because there aren't many compasses that you'll find, you know, the little handheld ones that'll go over 4 inches, but this one will. So I've measured the distance, which is 6.5 inches from our measurements, and I've drawn an arc, not just another dot. There we go. So anywhere that I mark between point A and that arc is going to be 6.5 inches. So there we go. At 6.5 inches, we are at point B. So we'll mark that on our paper pattern, and then we'll get to our next measurement. So the next measurement we need to take is where's the side seam going to be? What is the side of the neck? What is that measurement? So I'm going to use a T-square, and I'm just going to mark right where that side is going to be. Now the side, if you hold the T-square, you know, right up against the neck like that, right where it stops, that should be just about where your where the side hits, and that's where you're going to put the seams in any of your garments. So we're going to mark that. We're going to call that point C, and we've got our measurement at just a little over 3. It's about 3 5/8. So we're going to take our compass. We're going to set it at 3 5/8. We're going to tighten things up, make sure it's solid. We're going to put the point at point A, and then we're going to go ahead and just draw an arc, and where that arc falls on the line is our point C. So that is going to be our side seam marker. And this next point is going to be point D. So remember how I mentioned about the clavicle? So that's just about where you want your collar stand to end. So I'm going to go ahead and measure. So from point A to where I want to put the end, I'm going to mark it. So it's at about 1.5 inches. And we're going to call that our point D. So now let's go back to our paper pattern and make that notation. When you're using really short distances, like 1.5 inches, go ahead and switch to a handheld compass. It's going to be more manageable for you to use, and you know, as long as you tighten up your compass, it doesn't matter either one, it should be pretty solid. So I steady the compass at point A, and I'm going to draw an arc for where my point D is. Now I'm not going to join these lines just yet until we get our marks for the remaining 2 points. So now we want to see this measurement in the back, and we need to mark that as well in our pattern. So we need to find out the distance between that point and the point below. So we're pretty happy with that measurement. We've gone ahead and called that point E. So there you go. Let me move that so I can actually see what that measurement is. So it's about 1.25 inches. So again, we're going to go back to our handheld compass, go ahead and measure it out on a ruler. There we go, we're at 1.25 inches. Put the point at point B, and then go ahead and make an arc right underneath it. And we're going to label that point E. Now this last measurement we need to take is the side seam. So what is the difference between the top of the side seam and the bottom? Well, we need to know the distance. So we're going to call that point F. And then we'll just go ahead and measure one more time. This masking tape is bomb, but it is fiddly as anything. So now we've got our measurement. Again, we're going to go back to our handheld compass. We're going to go ahead and put in that measurement. We're going to put the metal point at point C. And then we're going to make an arc. And we'll go ahead and label that point F. Now the reason that you want to do an arc instead of just a dot is anywhere along that arc, I've gone ahead and made them a little bit bolder so you can see, anywhere along that arc is going to be within whatever that distance is that we measured, and that's really important. So we're just going to smooth the curves here. So the best way to do it, I found, is to just get a set of French curves. This one happens to be metric, but measuring in this case doesn't really matter. What we want is a sturdy curve that kind of will get us more along that line to true it a bit. Now I'm going to mark the more far ends of the arcs of D and E. Because I want a little bit of an kind of an angle between points B and E, and I want more of like, you know, an obtuse angle on point A. Because as the collar stand curves around over the shoulder and around the neck, the distance at the top of the collar is going to be a little bit shorter than the distance between the parts that are closer to the body. So the measurement between points D and E should be a little bit longer than the measurements between point A and B. So now I've drawn my pattern. What I've done is I've used my handheld compass to create a 5/8 inch measurement, and I will just use my compass to go right around the edges of the pattern that I've just created. And this is 5/8, so this is going to be our seam allowance. And when you make patterns for yourself, it's really important to be mindful to add a seam allowance. And I would strongly suggest that whatever seam allowance you're going to do, try to keep it consistent. You know, if you're going to make your seam allowance 1 centimeter, if you're making clothes for yourself, just commit to 1 centimeter. If you'd rather have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, that's totally fine. Just keep your seam allowance consistent between all the pattern pieces involved in your pattern. You know, the size doesn't matter in some cases, but it does have to be consistent. I'm going to go ahead and draw a line between point C and point F, because that's going to be our side seam. So let's say that we want to lengthen or shorten this collar. We'll cover that in another video. You're going to lengthen or shorten that between point C and point F. Awesome. So let's cut this baby out. I have some random scissors. These scissors I really only use for paper and cardboard and kind of more crafty stuff. They're sharp scissors, but I will never use them to cut fabric because A, they're really bad at cutting fabric, and B, I sometimes use these scissors to cut through things with like glues and adhesives on it, and I really don't want that stuff anywhere near my fabric. So if you have a pair of utility scissors, if those are going to be your paper pattern cutting scissors, just make sure that's all that they do. So now I've grabbed a scrap of muslin, and I'm lining up this muslin on grain. So I'm putting it on the straight grain. And what I'm going to do is I'm either going to mark it out in chalk. This is a really small pattern, so I'm just going to use pins because it's faster. So when I pin this pattern on, you'll notice I don't use a whole lot of pins. I'm using copy paper, so it's a very rigid piece of paper, and you don't really need that many pins. But you know, just for ease of cutting it out, I'm going to put a few, so 1 in each corner, 1 in the middle. It's plenty. And you really want it to stay flat so you can see from the back it's nice and flat back there. And now I'm going to use my tailoring shears. You know, if you're working with a more difficult fabric, you don't want to handle it too much. And when you cut fabric, you know, the closer you can keep the fabric to whatever your cutting surface is, the better, because that means you're not going to be picking up your fabric and playing with it and getting weird frayed edges. This is like cotton muslin, so that's not that big of a problem. But if there were a fabric like organza being cut out, picking up the material between cuts would be a huge problem. But we're just sort of making a little sample for today, so it doesn't really matter. Cool. And actually, you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and cut the marker for the side seams. Cutting the markers now is a good idea. It's a good visual cue to see if you're lining up the pattern properly or not. And just before we commit to anything, let's just double check. So I've gone ahead and basted where the 5/8 seam allowance is, so it's a little bit easier for us to see. And again, always double check before you start cutting or sewing anything. It's good to double check and make sure that you've got the right piece and that it's going the right direction. So here, I'm just going to fold over where the basting stitches were and put a couple of pins in there. That's so you can kind of see what it will look like once it's fully, you know, sewn down. Also, by folding over the seam allowance, this gives us another way to check to confirm that what we cut is actually the proper shape of the pattern that we made. With cotton muslin, it's not that big of a problem. But if this were, say, organza or organdy or anything with a really loose weave, drapey fabrics are always going to have this issue. Sometimes when you cut a pattern, the material will just sort of like be weird on you. I'm going to go ahead and cut some slits in the side seam because that side is going to drape over the shoulder, and by slicing little cuts there, it'll allow the fabric to actually fold properly. So we've put it on. We can see points A and D. So I went right along that middle. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's like a seam in the middle that you can see on the bias tape, and that was my marker. So as you can see, when we get to the part that was cut out, points B and points E are in the same place. We've got our points C and points F in the correct place. And we've also got our points A and points D in the correct place as well.